Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar on the digital area in Asia and beyond. Today, we're very happy to have two leading scholars, Professor David Yang and Professor Matilde BOMBARDINI, to talk about AI in China. David, the floor is yours, please.
So this is a joint work with BERAJA from MIT and Noam YUCHTMAN from LSE. I'm going to mostly talk about sort of this paper, data-intensive innovation in the state, and I'm going to draw evidence from AI firms in China. And hopefully, towards the end, I'm also going to sort of give you a view of some of the more recent work we've been doing, follow up on this particular paper. Okay, so the motivation for thinking about AI and the sort of the broadly speaking, the political economy of AI. At the angle we like to take is to highlight the fact that AI innovation and innovation in this general sector, which is going to have sort of ability to potentially change many aspects of the economy in coming decades, is that the sort of developing innovation in this sector is data intensive. And by that, we mean many of the recent advancements in AI technology, such as sort of facial recognition, such as chess mastery, such as voice recognition, are all done using algorithms that exist for at least several years, but recently applied to a large amount of data that has been sort of collected due to sort of various improvement in data consumption technology. Okay. The economic literature for the last few years to study sort of the development and the influence of AI innovation has largely focusing on data as an input into the sector, but data collected by private firms. How data collected by private firms and sort of the IO aspect of private firms collection data, how that's going to affect the AI innovation. Okay. However, if we look sort of back into the history and also certainly sort of as we stand now, states and various governments has been collecting large amount of data. And to a large extent, this is due to the states that's been providing a lot of key services, and they will continue to provide a lot of key services to the society. This ranges from states' provision of public security to states' provision of to healthcare, to education, to a lot of the sort of support for basic science. As states are sort of providing those services, inevitably, sort of as a way for the states to fill its role of providing public services and so on, so the states have, so inevitably will have to collect a lot of data. And oftentimes in domains such as these, the government data can actually exceed in both in the magnitude and the scope compared to the private data that's being allowed to collect by the private entity. Okay, and then oftentimes there are even lack sort of comparable substitutes completely from the private sector, because the public sector is the only sort of actor that allowed to collect those data. Okay. So I want to think about sort of a particular sort of AI firms who potentially can gain access to government data that does not have good private substitutes. And one common way for that to happen is for these private sort of AI firms to provide certain services or contracting through the states contracting out certain services to the AI firms. Okay, more concretely, think about sort of a facial recognition AI firms in China, which is the context I'm going to focus on in the talk today and in the paper. These facial recognition AI firms, a big part of the product development and the broad innovation is to train and fine-tune their facial recognition algorithm through data that involve or sort of can observe a lot of faces. And oftentimes these data in the largest quantity would be sort of video streams coming from CCTV cameras, coming from all sorts of video generating devices in the society. The states, so to the extent that the states' public security services, those public security units are collecting this kind of data, they control the CCTV cameras, they collect data through CCTV, and they contract out sort of the data analyst services to these facial recognition AI firms. These facial recognition AI firms will inevitably have access to those data because the goal, the role for this firm is to analyze this data. Okay. Now, once the data now flow to the firm server, the firm would sort of indirectly have access to those surveillance data that's being collected by the government, and the facial recognition firm could potentially use this data to train this algorithm and develop software, and broadly speaking, to start to improve their innovation that are data intensive in the AI sector. Okay, so given this, the question we want to ask in this paper is that, does firms' access to government data when they provide AI services to the state, which again implicitly is going to allow them to have access to this data during the service provision process, stimulate those firms' innovation in the AI sector. And in particular, not only innovation that's geared or targeted towards the government, because that's going to be somewhat mechanical, but thinking about sort of the AI innovation more broadly speaking to the commercial market that the government may or may not directly care about. Okay, so that's the question. We're going to sort of hopefully empirically try to highlight two particular mechanisms through which the access to government data could, in theory, stimulate commercial innovation, commercial AI innovation. The first one is that data sort of being a fairly different sort of input compared to the traditional inputs such as capital and human capital, that government data and more generally sort of the algorithm that's developed and coming out of government data are shareable across uses. Okay, so they can be used to develop AI software not only for the government purposes but also for the commercial markets, and oftentimes in a simultaneous way. So at least in the short run, the firm may not need to have any sort of allocation decision of whether to use this data for task 1 rather than task B. Okay, so broadly speaking, you can think about this as government data have potentially a high degree of economy of scope. Okay? And second, sort of firm, while they provide AI service to the state and sort of analyzing large amount of data sets to the state, may also learn to learn to manage and utilize large amount of data sets that they have previously not seen before. And this additional sort of improvement in data handling ability and this intermediary input, as you will, in managing and sort of taking advantage of large amount of data may be another way in which access to government data, large amount of government data may stimulate a spillover to the commercial sector innovation. And to the extent that these mechanisms are large enough, they could even crowd out sort of any traditional sort of type of forces that might allow firm to actually reallocate a lot of this intermediate resources to innovate just for the government, who the firm is now sort of having a particular contract with. Okay, so I'm going to show you. So this is the broadly speaking, this is the story we have in mind. I'm going to try to show demonstrate this to you more rigorously in China's facial recognition in the context of China's facial recognition AI sector. Now, before I get there, let me first give you sort of a quick sort of brief discussion about why do we care about this and what is the general implication of, to the extent that we do see some potential commercial spillover of access to government data, why does that matter? The first thing that matters is just within this context. Now, while we're for the bulk of the paper today, I'm going to focus on sort of within China variations. We're not going to make any statement about sort of China compared to other countries and so on. But I'm going to get to a little bit of this towards the end to think about sort of some of the ongoing work that we're currently doing. But this is at least sort of provide some suggestive evidence that for the past sort of half a decade, the very rapid growth in China's AI sector and very much frontier pushing innovation in the sector, being coinciding with the large expansion of government's sort of surveillance capacity and the procurement of AI through the public sector, which allowed a lot of the AI firms in China to have access to government data, maybe one of the reasons why China is becoming sort of a global leader in AI. Okay. And second, sort of from a more general and conceptual perspective, we hope that this highlights a particularly sort of interesting role for the state in the data-intensive economies. Now, the economist so far has been largely focusing on the states acting as a regulator in the sector, that the state's going to as we speak now, the discussion regarding sort of the privacy regulation towards the tech firms in the US, for example, that the state is acting as a regulator for the privately collected data due to antitrust concerns or privacy concerns. But what we're going to highlight here is that because states has been a major plays a major role in data collection, at least in certain domains, sort of its procurement of AI services and its ability to share data to a certain firm is going to be intentionally or not going to have industrial policy-like consequences, because that's going to provide one of the key input into this industry, and that can stimulate a more broad innovation above and beyond what's just sort of applicable to the government or for the public sector uses, and it can also potentially shape the direction of innovation, broadly speaking, in the AI sector. Okay, so the general implication setting aside, let me now get into the details about try to show this more rigorously. Now, there's a couple of empirical challenges of answering the question I posed, sort of whether AI access to government data sort of stimulate commercial innovation. Now, ideally, we would like to compare software output changes across firms and within firms before and after they received the government contracts that give them access to data of different quantity. Okay, that's the sort of the ideal exercise we would like to do. Now, that's going to have a couple of data challenges because most of the variables, both on the left-hand side and right-hand side, are not readily available. Sort of before we started this project. So to do this exercise, we will need broadly speaking, three data sets. We need a data set that linked all the AI firms in China to the government contracts in China that issue or sort of procure those AI contracts, AI services. So that creates a link between sort of the potential data access between the AI firms and the sort of the data that they might be receiving from the government. Okay. We also will need to sort of sort of observe AI firms sort of output. In most of these firms, it's going to be software output. Okay, that's going to be sort of linked to the product innovation as sort of using the term of the innovation literature. And also, not only do we need to observe sort of the overall output of the software, we need to be able to sort of classify whether those software are meant for commercial purposes or for the government purposes, because it's the potential spill over or crowding into the commercial sector. That's what we're mostly interested in. Okay, to the extent these software output are not readily available, we also need to build this data set from scratch. And finally, this is going to be a sort of a fairly generic challenges for conducting research on data or sort of the AI sector, which is as a key input, which is data. The data itself is oftentimes not directly observable. So, okay, so we need to find some way to measure and proxy for the amount of data that these AI firms are not having access to when they work with the government. Okay, so that's on the observational side, and then we're going to have sort of the more traditional identification challenges where firms who receive a government contract is obviously not going to be randomly selected. So we're going to deal with the firm selection in our empirical specification, and also we're going to need to sort of think through the empirical specification that deal with that contracts. Of course, come with multiple things. It comes with capital. It comes with potential signaling of connection with the government, in addition to access to government data. So we'll need to hopefully find the empirical specification that can sort of sort of isolate the role that played by the data. Okay, so that's the challenge. Let me quickly sort of describe to you sort of the three data sets that we built, and we'll hopefully sort of this will make this public available, and it will become sort of useful resources for others to study AI sectors in China. The first one is actually combining two different sources of data. We sort of construct a roster of all the facial recognition AI firms that have existed over the last decade. There are about 8,000 of these firms, so this is actually a fairly sort of scattered industry. We're going to sort of construct these firm roster from both the Chinese sources and the US-based sources. So we think this is fairly comprehensive. It covers a wide range of AI firms across different nature. Okay, we're then going to also take sort of the universe of government's procurement contracts in China, and vast majority of those contracts is going to happen at the local government level. Okay, so over the last 10 years, there are about 3 million such contracts that's being sort of registered by the official Ministry of Finance procurement database. Okay, and then we're going to match these two. So for each contract, we're going to link the government buyer to the AI supplier, under the assumption that if the local government is buying sort of procuring something from a particular facial recognition AI firms, it's the AI services that's being procured. Okay, and for the bulk of our analysis, we're going to focus on public security units of the government. So these are local police stations. These are local sort of public security offices, which control sort of essentially the civilians and then sort of the security network of the particular city, the street cameras and that. And that's particularly sort of the type of services that they're procuring from the AI firms to help them analyze the street camera data. Okay, so that's data set number one. Data set number two, sort of observing AI firms' software production. One challenge that we're facing is that we cannot simply go to sort of the firm's quarterly releases to look at the software or any production, because all but one of the facial recognition AI firms are public listed firms. But what makes our life slightly easier is that in China, all software firms need to register the software with China's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology before the software can be released to the client. Okay, so we're going to take all the registered software from the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, match it back to the AI firms. So that's going to give us all the software products that's been developed that includes sort of new software, completely new software, or major upgrades of the existing software. And we can cross-check with McAfee, which is one of the only facial recognition AI firms that have gone through IPO, and we can look at the IPO prospectus and see what software product that the McAfee listed themselves. And our registration sort of the base software observation is fairly complete. Okay, as I mentioned, just knowing how many software there is not enough. We need to also be able to sort of classify what the software is useful for different sort of sectors. Okay, so we can actually tell a lot of this already just simply from the software descriptions. To take the example of visual recognition systems for smart retail, this is a sort of a facial recognition software that's not potentially used by the government, but used by the commercial sector. Okay, so this is going to have actually a lot of commercial value because it's going to allow the retailers to tell who is a repeated customer, what sort of products that person might be hesitant in buying, and then you can sort of potentially design sort of individualized advertisements based on this. Okay, a software that has the title Smart City Real-Time Monitoring System on Main Traffic Routes. This is sort of a software we think that government is the main buyer. This is software that's made for the government purposes. That's potentially going to be also being part of the AI procurement contracts. And software like this we're going to label that as government software. Okay, we're going to also have a residual category where general sort of facial recognition software that's developed by these firms that we cannot tell directly whether it's for commercial or government, and our kind of classification algorithm is actually going to be fairly sort of conservative. And we're going to potentially put more software in the category 3 when we're unsure about the particular sort of intended customer it is for. Okay, we're not going to be able to do this all by hand given the volume of the software. So we use the neural network technology to help us do this. So we manually sort of labeled 13,000 softwares, and then we train this machine learning algorithm to classify the rest. Our accuracy rate is fairly high, and we can do a lot of robustness exercise to make sure that our result is not driven by sort of any sort of our choices of the configuration of this particular algorithm. Okay, and finally, sort of a final data set we sort of need to construct together is some proxy for the firm's access to government data. Again, ultimately, sort of we would like to compare firms' innovation after receiving a government contract that have high rich data, get access to rich amount of data versus actually to relatively scarce amount of data. Okay, so how do we proxy for the amount of data the government, these contracts are providing to the firm? So the idea is that we're going to focus on public security contracts. Again, these are contracts sort of fairly homogeneously coming out of local police departments, and then we're going to use we're going to then go back to these procurement contracts and look at the hardware procurement of each of the local, so all the prefectural police department in China, and look at, so over the last 10 years, how many high resolution street cameras these police department has been procured. Okay, so then using this, the amount of the stock of the street cameras that these police department has been procuring, we're going to call a AI public security contracts to be data rich if that contract has been signed with a local police department that has above medium density or level. It doesn't actually matter whether you use density or level amount of street cameras that's being sort of constructed up to that point. Okay, if the contract is signed with a local police department that has relatively fewer below medium number of high resolution street cameras, we're going to call that data scarce. This is trying to capture that precisely sort of the data that's going to be useful for the facial recognition firm is coming through street cameras. The more street cameras there is, both in terms of levels of density, the more or sort of denser or richer or higher volume this street camera street camera video stream is going to come in to the firm. Okay, so that's going to be our baseline proxy for data richness. Okay, so our baseline specification is going to be a triple diff specification. We're going to compare cumulative software releases of these facial recognition AI firms before and after these firms received its first data-rich contracts with a local police department, relative to those facial recognition firms whose first data-rich contract with the local police department is a data scarce one. Okay, so let me slow down here a bit. So the three layers of differences that we're going to build into the triple diff is that we're going to always control for firm fixed facts. So this is going to compare within the same firm before and after the first contract comes in. And we can do this at a very high frequency level. And the baseline is going to be semi-year, but we can even sort of do it at monthly level, and we can still see a effect. These facts actually show up very quickly. So we're going to have firm fixed effects. We're going to also have calendar time fixed effects. Again, in the baseline, it's going to be semi-year fixed effects. So this is going to take advantage of different firms' first contract with the local police department. It's going to arrive at different time, different calendar time. Okay, so you can think about this as a stacked event study across multiple firms. So this is going to take out sort of any sort of industry level general trend that might affect the firm's innovation across the board. And finally, we're going to compare sort of the public security contracts that are data rich versus data scarce. Again, the way we define data scarce and data rich is by whether that particular local police department at the time when the contract was issued has above or below medium level of street cameras, high resolution street cameras that will be available to provide video streams to those AI firms. Okay, so the primary sort of coefficient of interest, which I'm going to show you, is this beta 1 coefficient, which is this triple diff interaction term. So relative to the data scarce contracts effect, what is the additional effects coming from the data rich contracts? Okay, and again, sort of this is going to be, we can argue whether this is, we're being too conservative here, but this beta 1 or this triple diff coefficient is taking out any other things that might come with the public security contracts, the generic public security contracts, such as some access to capital, access to potential sort of government sort of relationship and so on. But this is sort of try to parse out this additional margin coming from sort of data richness. Okay, so that's the baseline specification. Now, our primary outcome is going to be sort of the amount of software that's going to be that's sort of the firm produced for the commercial market. And I'm doing this in a cumulative way, just so that the magnitudes become a bit easier to interpret. Each dots here is a non-parametrically sort of estimated time coefficient relative to the semi-year when the contract arrives, which is marked by the vertical red line here. Okay, so again, this is the triple diff coefficient. So this is the differential increases in commercial software production relative to a data scarce contract that some other firms might have received during this sort of decade period. Okay, so what you see here is that, well, there's no trend. In fact, if anything, there's a bit of a slightly downward trend towards the firm receiving the contract. The data-rich contract is differentially generating more commercial software to the firm who receive it. They put a number on this. This is sort of relative to the data scarce contract. The data rich contract is generating 2 new software products to those AI firms over the course of 3 years, and that's actually fairly sizable. This is 20% of the pre-contract software production in the commercial sector. Okay.
David, just let you know, you have 3 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. And to make it sort of this magnitude a bit even more sort of stark. We see sort of a simultaneous sort of increase of the software production to the government side. So this is net out any potential forces or incentives the firm might have to allocate a lot of intermediate inputs towards providing things, producing things for the government. Net of that, we still see sort of a fairly sizable increases in the firm's commercial software producers, and this sort of a speed of crowding in is actually fairly quick compared to sort of similar sort of crowding in that the people have documented in other contexts. Okay. I won't have time to talk through sort of evaluating some of the alternative hypotheses. I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A, but sort of we do as much as we can to make sure that our result is not driven by selection, firm selection at different times, and also sort of we try to parse out even or control for even more aspects of the productive aspects coming from contracts that's not from data, that's still not being taken care of by the triple diff, and again overall sort of our results is fairly robust to the extent that we can control for these things. Okay. I want to show you one final graph before I give you sort of one last piece about some ongoing work we're doing on this research agenda. To think about the mechanism of what exactly is allowing the firms to have this fairly rapid crowding into the commercial sector innovation. I want to show you two evidence here. The first one is that there's some degree of quote unquote learning by doing, where we see the firms using our same baseline specification, we see that the firms are producing also at the same time more data contemporary software. These are software that allow them to store a large amount of data, to transmit or manage a large amount of data. So that suggests the firms are also just upgrading their technology, intermediate technology, to handle large amount of data, and that might be something that's sort of shareable, a shareable intermediate input that will benefit commercial sort of sector. Innovation, but even controlling for these data complementary software production, though, that's not sort of completely going to explain sort of the increase in a commercial sort of software production per se, which means that this intermediate input, while being useful and happening, no, it's not the entire story. So that suggests at least sort of the degree to which the data can be directly shared across uses potentially also play the role. Okay, so that's the key results that we have in this particular paper. As I mentioned, sort of we hope that this shows that data being a very important shareable input and government being a very important player in collecting that data is going to have an impact on the AI firms who have access to data because a key input has been provided by the government. That's gonna mean that the government is going to play implicitly a industrial policy like role to the AI sector, even though the sort of the data provision in this particular context is not sort of intentional in a way that it's not meant to grow the AI sector per se, but it's simply because the government wants to use AI firms to increase its public security provision. Okay. Some of the more recent work that in the last couple of months that we've been doing is try to open up sort of on one end the political economy black box of sort of what exactly drives those local sort of governments to purchase AI, and we link this to sort of occurrence of local unrest and so on, and sort of given sort of Matilde's sort of specialty and so on. I want to point out that we're the other direction we're going with this is that while the results I show you just now does not tell you anything about China's competitive advantage in AI because everything is within China variation here. But sort of this strongly implies that countries such as China might have a competitive advantage in AI, and that might be very different from other frontier tech. So we're being sort of try to collect information on all the global trade in AI and try to match. So this is still a very infant sort of industry. So a lot of countries are not trading each other. So even just in extensive margin, there's a lot of variation. So I want to highlight two sort of pretty shocking facts, and then very different from other frontier tech, which is the fact number one: China's dominating global AI trade. 50% of the global trade of AI involve China as an exporter. This is not what you see in any other frontier tech that we can find, such as biotech or clean energy. And for example, compared to the US, which the export link is much smaller compared to China. Okay, and second, potentially somewhat more worrisomely from a political economy perspective, that is the relatively speaking, the China's export of AI is more likely to go towards weak democracies or autocracies than rich democracies, which tend to import sort of high tech and expensive tech. And this pattern of China's exporting of AI to the weak democracies and relatively more likely to go towards autocracies and weak democracies is very different from the pattern of the US export of AI, which is quite predominantly sort of towards democracy, which is happening through the regular US trade, in high tech. So this is pointing towards that countries such as China might actually indeed have a competitive advantage in the frontier tech, in particular of AI. And the AI tech that's developed out of China may not be politically neutral because it does not sort of have the similar pattern of rich country and democracy tend not to more likely to buy it, but we might see a very different pattern, seems to see a very different pattern in this sector. Okay, I'm going to end here and very much looking forward to the comments and to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, David, for the fantastic presentation. Now let me hand the audience over to Matilde. Matilde, please.
All right, so this was a lot of fun, and I've seen now this paper and the other paper, the more recent one that David was referring to, and I'm a big fan of this research agenda. So obviously, this is an impressive data collection, and this is only one of many papers that I'm sure are coming, and I'm looking forward to all of them. But the big contribution is that this is the first paper to show that government AI software procurement has important spillovers on commercial AI development. And then that's together with the other paper that David kind of briefly referred to which I'm actually going to go back to later. I guess in general, this contributes to a wide literature that's pretty much cited in the paper and one in many references, and one of the paper there is Moretti, Steinwander, and Van Reenen. Sort of how does the government can stimulate sort of frontier research? But more in general, I guess, spillovers from procurement contracts can be even sort of in coming from size, from sort of demand shocks that are then very permanent. And so there's a paper, for example, by my colleague Fred Finan and Claudio Ferraz and Sherman that sort of studies, for example, the fact that when you win a procurement contract, then this persists in the long run. So even the firm, even after the contract is over, then you have this sort of spillover. But here, we're going to have like a specific, the spillover is not going to come from economies of scale, but economies of scope, okay? So all right. So the research question again is, does a firm that received data-intensive AI software government contract produce more or less commercial AI software? And the answer is more. And I'll go back to this, but it's amazing how almost exactly by the same amount as the government AI software. So let me go back to that. So David actually spent quite a bit of time talking about the sort of vast data collection effort. So I just want to re-emphasize how impressive this is. And so we're talking about more than, almost 8,000 AI firms. Then there's procurement contracts. There's 2.9 million procurement contracts. Then this impressive analysis of software registration records with a lot of machine learning sort of to determine which types of contracts we're talking about. And again, the key here is try to distinguish between government sort of scope and commercial. And this seems like a really, in terms of data collection and manipulation, that's a big achievement. So in the end, we end up with this 1,000 AI firms that are involved in facial recognition in particular, and 28,000 contracts, and then all this software. So this is, all right, this is sort of the bulk of the data. And then you have this sort of that data intensity, this sort of distinction. And this is where I'm going to sort of talk about sort of one, honestly, they have done so many robustness checks that I'm just going to sort of lay out there. I don't think this is a big deal, but at the moment you have this density of surveillance cameras per population. So, and then you also have the number of surveillance cameras. But I was thinking that if I had the population and surveillance cameras, I wouldn't necessarily take one divided by the other. Because again, the explanation is that this is, you would like to have repeated measures of the same face over and over again from different angles so that you can learn. But I was just thinking, if I had, what this means is that if I have Harbin that has 10 million people versus Daqing that has 2.9 million people, then this would imply that contracts that from Daqing are more data intensive than in Harbin. And so I'm just wondering, are they? So my guess would have been maybe to multiply, the surveillance cameras times the population. I don't know if this makes any difference. But this is one dimension maybe I would have played with a little bit more. And maybe even surveillance cameras times population, because that's the total amount of data that I have divided by maybe a measure of density, and essentially how many times I can capture people kind of passing in these cameras. So I would have played a little bit more, given the importance of this data intensity measure a little bit more. And so then I kind of looked at this map, which I found very interesting. And then I saw that this is data richness. So you see the black is sort of the data rich areas. And so I see that, so the data rich prefectures within a province. So you see that there's a lot of Yunnan and Guangxi, for example. So this is a lot of data rich. And then I was wondering, are these, should I think, when I looked at the map, I thought, should I think that this is where the contracts are going to be signed or not? You know, are the firms also in these areas? And this is where I have questions. I mean, this is not doubting any of this, but it's more like, should we assume that the firms are located close to the government units that request the services? So if it's the government Yunnan, is it a firm there? I suspect that there's not that many AI firms in Yunnan, but that's my guess. And then a later exercise suggests that we shouldn't think that these are close by, okay? But in the other paper that I'm going to call it BKYY paper, the one that Autocracy, in which briefly what they do is that they look at, which is recently presented, David presented at the NBR, in which they look at, for example, unrests and how unrests sort of influence the demand for these sort of contracts. And to me, in that case, it seemed to imply that these were local firms, because then the idea is then you want to have an exogenous demand for these services. And so areas that receive rain, for example, have less unrest, and therefore less demand for these services. And I thought that was demand for local services. So I'm just in general, I would have liked to know a lot more about the location of these firms and the trade structure of these firms, or who contracts with whom in which province and so on. Because obviously if the firms, you know, and again, I don't know whether this is true, but if these firms are also where the demand is high, these firms, you know, for example, you know, if the firms supplying Yunnan sort of police department are in Yunnan, then this picture here would suggest, could be that, you know, it's the firms in Yunnan sort of they are sort of catching up. There's some convergence, you know, if they're systematically related to, you know, these are relatively backwards firms and they're sort of catching up, then maybe the thing to do is to introduce sort of a province times sort of the treatment, sort of to use only within province sort of variation. But again, I'm just saying, the most important thing about this is I'd like to know the geography of all these firms and whether this is sort of a local demand, or are these all located in Beijing and Shanghai and I don't know, Guangzhou, and you know, are they operating in other areas? And then, you know, then the other paper becomes sort of, I need to sort of re-understand what the RAIN instrument was doing in the other paper. So this is an event study specification. And again, my preferred notation is to break down this TI. So this is essentially as a staggered sort of event study specification. And so what you see here is that you have this, from 4 periods before to 6 periods after this first time you receive a contract. And then I have this, you know, this TI really, if you break it down, it's an indicator function that counts the difference between the present time T and the first contract period I, and when that is equal to T, then that dummy turns on. So, and then the emphasis on the beta 1T, you know, essentially emphasizes a triple diff in diff. Okay, so data is equal to 1 if the first contract is data intensive in the sense that it's in these areas with a lot of cameras and a lot of surveillance cameras. So the main result is really this, these two graphs. So, and when I was looking at them, so if you sort of, you know, you look at the magnitude. So this is, you know, there's kind of hovering around 1. Okay, maybe, you know, in the 6th period, maybe a little bit higher, but it's hovering around 1. So you get an extra commercial software, in terms of piece of commercial software. And then you get an extra piece of government software if you, you know, after you contract with a data intensive versus a non-data intensive sort of local government. Now one is that's the surprising part is that this is really the same number, sort of it's a similar number. So I get all the data and I do all the government extra software. And this was not clear if this included the software that the government is commissioning or not. So I guess I'd like to know that. But this one is really surprising. The fact that the spillover is almost like immediate. The timing is very similar, and it's sort of one, it's creating, even in terms of elasticity, it's almost the same. So, and this is actually I went to the appendix and sort of took out this table, this is actually the two double differences. Okay, so it's the two diff in diff instead of the diff in diff in diff. So this is commercial and this is government. So even in the double differences, these graphs look very, very similar. So it's astounding the degree of shareability of these inputs. So this is telling me that these inputs are shared 100% with other types of software, And I'm kind of surprised, to be honest, about how shareable this implies. So these are very, very similar among, government and commercial. Again, both differences are. Of course, when you take the difference, the third difference is also very similar. So that's something I would invite you to maybe discuss a little bit more extensively, both the timing and this 100% shareability, and also the magnitude of this. So when you go, I guess I have the summary statistics later on, and but when you go to that, you have an average of 10 in the summary statistics. So it's of both government and commercial. So you're starting with a sort of let's say a baseline of 10. And then this is an extra one piece of software, at least for commercial and government use. So it's a similar semi-elasticity as well. And if you think about, this is a 10% increase. Let's say take this one measure. And so that's if it's a 10% increase in software with a constant returns to scale, that means that there's an implicit 10% subsidy. So that you're providing 10% of inputs essentially for free, which I'm going back to later. And so that's a huge number, okay? And then and I guess the thing that I was a bit surprised also is that why would government software increases be larger for data intensive contracts? Like, given that I'm getting this contract, I'm getting a contract for one piece of government software. I'm not even sure. I guess the idea is that you get that extra software piece and then you get extra ones. And those are, I guess, I wanted to break it down because, if I am commissioned, I get a contract for an additional piece of software, I'd like to know, I guess what you're implying is that then if you get the data intensive one, that you get many more government later on, either commissions or that you get better at making those and you get more contracts. So I'd like to break down, what's the sort of the immediate effect of getting an extra sort of contract versus the subsequent effect. Why is this this is talking about this this part, right? So I'm expecting you should get an extra piece of software because that's what you're commissioned. But then, and actually, no, even why would I get it differentially in data intensive versus non-data intensive? So this must be all the indirect effect. So again, I'm not clear on what this, how to break it down and whether I should even expect it for the government contracts. Should I even expect this to be larger for data intensive than not? Okay. All right. So there are many alternative stories that are addressed. In fact, all the ones I could come up with, they're there. Okay, so there's and the authors are very open about the differences between these two types of who gets these different contracts. So in particular, there's one that stands out. So if you compare these contracts by high and low surveillance capacity, you see that these high intensity are served by firms that are much higher, that have much higher capitalization. So size is one of the big differences. They're also older, so they've been established earlier. And then this is what I was mentioning earlier. So software production before the first contract received, that's 10 on average for both commercial and private and government, commercial and government. So that's where my numbers are coming on before, this one additional piece of software. So that's why 1 out of 10, that's a big number. Okay. All right. But so they do a ton of robustness checks to check out these alternative stories. And thankfully, David didn't have time to go through all of these, so I get to do this because 25 minutes discussion is a long one. And even for me that I talk a lot. So one major concern that is sorted out immediately is sorting into public security contracts, right? So, and they only look within public security contract firms. So that's one that's sorted out immediately. Then you have the sort of selection of better firms in general, right? And so, and I'll go back to this, but, there's really no pre-trends, even in the differences, the simple difference in differences, there's no pre-trends that I can detect. There's, if you're worried about time invariant characteristics, so more productive firms being selected, and then those firms doing better in the future, no, this is with firm fixed effects. If you're worried about signaling of high quality firms that could come from just an endorsement by the government, well, they use only subsidiaries of past suppliers. So even like firms that are in general linked to firms, to AI sort of parents or other firms in the group that have been past suppliers of government. So they've been already endorsed, so there's no new information that's coming out of this endorsement. And then actually they do really an impressive number of the following. So whenever you're dealt with this sort of, you have these sort of essentially it's an interaction, right? So it's a treatment with some, heterogeneity, right? It's an heterogeneity analysis. You're always worried that there could be a number of things that are correlated with with data I in this case, right? That could be driving, right? So the fact that you get a contract with a province that has high data or a prefecture that has high data intensity could be then doing other things, right? It could be that they have higher capital, these are more richer contracts. They are, other dimensions. And so the key to this is to interact this TI with all the other things you're worried about, which is what they do. Okay, so there's a number of things that they do, which is interacting. So again, this is, we've controlled for time invariant characteristics of the firm, done. But then there's time varying effects of time invariant characteristics, right? So it could be that, for example, firm productivity interacts with getting these contracts later on, and then you have these heterogeneous effects coming from, not from the data intensity, but from the heterogeneity of the firm. And they take care of that by interacting, as I said, the treatment with this other characteristics. Okay, so there's an impressive number of those, and also contract characteristics. So that's what I was saying earlier. So these two are controlled for, and they don't change. So I guess maybe David can tell me if this one is already addressed. So I'm just thinking that prefectures that are I'm not really worried, honestly. I think this is not a sort of a story that I particularly believe, but what if prefectures that use intensity surveillance cameras are better at picking firms with growth potential, right? Again, there should be some pre-trends in this case, so I'm not terribly concerned, but this is the only thing I could come up with that maybe is not addressed in your several robustness checks. Now, the mechanism, there are two. As David was saying, there's a direct effect that can come from shareable data. That's what he calls direct. And then there's indirect, right? And it's indirect to be positive or negative. So the direct effect, as you get these data, then this helps you in other output. But the fact that you get these data could help you develop other software that then helps you develop commercial AI. And so it's very neat that they have these, they can observe these data complementary non-AI software. So I'm going to call it DCNA. And they show that this DCNA software increases. So there is some indirect effect. So that's number one. But second, they want to show that they want to control for the pre-contract DCNA software importance to show that it's not just an indirect effect. Okay, so there's two sort of checks that are really nice. All right, so this is where I'd like you to push maybe a bit more. So the government seems to be giving away a very useful input to private companies. Okay, and the usefulness should be correlated with the current stock of data, right? Or the firm or the price that firms are paying for data. Is there any proxy in this? Because I would love to see that less constrained firms have this smaller effect for this, right? So that if you were, if you had any measures of, current stock or, access to data that they have, then you should see a smaller effect of the subsidy, right? Because they already have data. The other thing is, and this is something that you can check directly. So the moment I'm giving you this data, I'm giving to you maybe for free or not. So if I give it to you for free, that's surprising. Why would I give it to you for free? Given that I'm giving you a 10% subsidy. So the procurement cost should show some of this, right? When I pay you for the service, do I pay you less when I'm giving you a lot of data? So in the procurement cost, you have the monetary value of the contract. And so does a government agency with high data intensity get any discount on an otherwise similar contract relative to a low intensity data? I mean, the government that's giving you a lot of data should be getting a discount on the service that you're providing, because they're giving it to you otherwise for free. And then the other thing is, as I said earlier, there's this 100% immediate shareability with between commercial and government uses. And so I'm wondering if there's any way that you can detect this, you can have differences in the shareability of the data. So obviously facial recognition software is immediately shareable. That's what your estimates seem to imply. But maybe there are ways for you to check that, maybe companies that do facial recognition, but also do AI for, I don't know, reading CAT scans or things, essentially those for which this is not immediately sort of shareable. Do I see that? I mean, I should see as a placebo or a much smaller effect for those types of firms. So I know that you've been able to classify all these all these uses of AI and so of software, and so maybe there is a way for you to see a smaller, because I'm worried about this 100% shareability, immediate shareability. That's sort of so any heterogeneity in that dimension would be really reassuring. And then finally, I guess, given these immense benefits for AI firms, why is just Chinese government so selective in subsidizing only a few lucky firms? If this is so large as an effect, I doubt that the Chinese government doesn't know that this is beneficial for these firms. And why are they doing it? Why are they keeping it? If the goal is to increase the, I mean, I guess the immediate goal of the at least the individual prefecture may not be to increase, China's AI sort of dominance, but if this is so useful, a 10% subsidy, then they should be doing it more widely. And then I guess you didn't discuss, and the paper sort of seems to imply that the Chinese government or local government units don't place any explicit restriction on use of contract-related data. It'd be good to know, if there's why they're not. And then you mentioned this sort of you mentioned at the beginning a very interesting direction of like shaping the direction of innovation. So it seems like that AI could be useful in many fields. And of course, this seems to imply that facial recognition, I mean, this type of government subsidy, I'm going to call it, is essentially pushing China into the dominance in facial recognition software in particular, right? So and so now that you've shown me all those graphs that I hadn't seen before, all those pictures of trade flows, I'm just thinking, that should show up in those trade flows, and sort of seeing that it's particularly in facial recognition AI relative to other type of AI software that China is specializing. And in general, is this making China sort of exit really, relatively speaking, other types of AI research, sort of, again, medical use ones and so on. And then finally, this is sort of the elephant in the Zoom room. And so that obviously, this is all, I'm out of time.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Sorry. But you're about to finish. That's fine.
Yeah, that's it. And so I guess this all comes at a huge cost for personal freedom and privacy. I kind of have to say this as this is something that is in the back of my mind. It's so obvious, but I think it's worth saying. And so this is a super exciting research agenda, and I'm sure it's going to be a super influential paper. And thank you for inviting me to discuss it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matilde, for the comprehensive, very thoughtful discussions. David, would you like to respond to Matilda's comments and suggestions first, before we open floor for further discussions?
Sure. Yeah. So let me thank you, Matilde, for these great comments, and they're very comprehensive. And then, so I guess given the time, I certainly won't have time to go through all your comments. So I'll highlight a couple of sort of key ones. So on the sort of how to measure the data richness, I think that's a good point. So I think we thought we'd try sort of both two ends of the spectrum of density and just pure level, and it doesn't seem to matter. So probably sort of variation within the middle probably won't matter, but I think it would be nice to show actually it doesn't more explicitly. I think sort of there's indeed some confusion, I guess, sort of with the paper I recently presented, which is, for these firms, most of these facial recognition AI firms are not local firms. In fact, most of them are headquartered in big cities. And then, as you see from the map, most of the contracts are with essentially across the board. So that's the basic feature. Now, of course, there are a few exceptions where when the Shanghai local governments are procuring this contract, it's going for a local firm because that local firm happened to be also one of the best firms. And then so that certainly there's some overlap. Now, how does that work then with the other paper? We're trying to use sort of local sort of unrest shocks. So the confusion, I think I did sort of a bad job that day when I presented the empirical strategy, is that it still has to go through its contracts. So the contract creates a link with a local government who's issued out those contracts in this local sort of protest shocks with a facial recognition AI firm who sits somewhere else, but now experiencing or take the data coming from a political sensitive environment. So that's where sort of, I think it's the contacts of non-local firms get those contracts are across the board, and there's some confusion there. On magnitude, this is a great point. I think we were in fact sort of in the earlier version of the paper, we were trying to explicitly try to estimate this quote unquote economy of scope parameter, and an estimator that we get as you saw eyeballing it is actually very stable, shockingly stable over time, which is not 100%, but it's roughly stable around sort of 65 to 70%. That's the rough, depending on your prior, that still is very high. So I think the two parts of it that's probably shocking, as you point out, the magnitude is high, which means that a unit of data can really be used across multiple purposes with maybe some small friction across multiple purposes, but at least within the narrow domain, it's very shareable and it's very simultaneous. So once I think our intuition is that they already have all the infrastructure built. They already know the algorithms. They already know sort of the rough skeleton of the product. They just need to fine tune the numbers to make sure it's really accurate. Once they know that, they do this across the board. This also relates to your other points of what are the regulations on making data, letting firm or restricting firm to use sort of data coming out of these contracts. I think part of this is that even in the most regulated environment, this is very hard to restrict because the firm can give back all the data, but as long as then you use the data to fine tune this algorithm, firm almost always retain property rights over the algorithm, and then the algorithm can be shareable. So all the economic scope can go through if you push this one level above data to the algorithm level. So I think that's part of the process. I think you mentioned a few other things about sort of firms, picking firms and so on. There's one sort of picture I didn't show in the talk today, is that in fact we see that the contract that has more data has more bidders, and which then in fact sort of have a lower bidding price. Which the firms are also sort of essentially pretty sophisticated, knowing that getting a contract with a very high data-rich local government is beneficial, given these are data-intensive firms. But at the larger level, though, you're calling this as a discount and subsidy, and sort of thinking, I think your final comments about sort of why does the government giving away sort of these very important sort of inputs to certain firms. I would turn this question around to highlight two things. The first one is that while the Chinese government is doing all sorts of industrial policy related to AI, I wouldn't call this particular, this is what I mean by this is our indirect or unintended industrial policy, because I think that especially thinking about the second paper of the protest paper, the government is when the local police department are buying AI contracts, the local police department don't care about AI industry per se. They just simply want to use data to provide services. And the nature of these data services firm is that if you buy my services, you need to give me a data to help you analyze the data. So the data has to be sort of shared with the firm. And in fact, these are not even sort of subsidied out. The government is paying those firms to get access to some of the data. So it's very unintended on top of the more direct, more traditional industrial policy in pushing. So I think the part that these input are giving out because of the service provision sort of procedure make it a bit special. I may have like two final points to highlight. The second one I want to highlight is that compared to the sort of the degree of sort of the input that sort of come with the other sort of procurement contracts and then spillover, such as the Moretti paper you mentioned. And I think the sort of the what we see here, which strikes us as quite unique, is that oftentimes you see firms crowding in. Think about the standard story of Boeing gets contracts from NASA and then start to develop commercial air jets later. That sort of spillover, that to the extent that the literature has documented, either happened quite sort of with a long lag, because there is really a short run sort of crowding out, and then the engineer take the know-hows and a decade later develop commercial stuff. Which is the Boeing example, or it has sort of a forgetting effect, which is some of the development literature find. There's immediate crowding in, and sort of 2 years later, people forget about things, and then the crowding disappear. So here we actually see sort of not only immediate crowding in, but also pretty persistent crowding, which again seems to highlight some unique nature of data being a different sort of input that played a role here. Yes, so let me end here actually, given the time constraint. But thank you again for your comments. These are super helpful.
Yeah, thanks. No, we don't have much time left. Bernie, you've been waiting. So.
I really, thank you, David. Thank you, Matilde. I learned a lot from the presentation and the discussions. I have two questions which reflect that I have not yet read the paper and I am uninitiated in this area of research. My first question is, would there be an asking the relevant question effect? So a government asked me to do something and provide some service for the government unit. And would that likely means that I am given a very relevant question? For us who look into and teaching data analytics, we know that the very important thing is to ask the interesting, relevant question. So is there providing the right question effect in generating the results that you observe? And the second question I have is in your last two slides, and the Chinese dominance of the exports of their product to certain countries. Is this a matching of the product characteristics and the need of the location, or it is an outcome of political differences?
Right. These are great questions. The first one about sort of does government just I mean, and the slightly different way of putting a question is, for example, if the government, because their experience of handling large amount of data in certain domains for years, they're just better at dealing with data and know what's the most useful applications for data. And once the firm contract with those government, then they know those secrets of handling data, and hence sort of generates the spillover. So that's more generally, I will put that in the category of some, government is handing out some know-hows that's related to the data. I think there's, we want to rule this out completely, but at least to the extent that, again, coming back to the point that this spillover is happening very immediately, suggests that at least in the very short run, that degree of that spillover is probably happening simply because intermediary input has been produced, or the data has been directly shared. But in the slightly medium run, in a matter of sort of a few years, I think some of the more general sort of know-how may be transferred, as you described. So we want to have a sort of a good empirical strategy of completely sort of separating these two out. The second one of it's a question about, essentially a question about biases or distortions of what this AI. So, and this is also to Matilde's last point, which I didn't have to talk through. Like, does this make China pushing in this particular direction of AI, then crowding out other direction of AI? And if this particular direction of AI is very prone to what China needs AI to begin with, I think the fact that sort of, I didn't show this in today's paper, the fact that a lot of this AI developed out of the needs for suppressing protests in China, and a lot of these AI products are exported towards countries that we call autocracy and weak democracy, to us strongly suggests that these are not politically neutral products. At least a part of this is useful for sort of enhancing political control, and sort of certainly also going to be useful for increasing public security, which you can call that a bit slightly more political neutral. And sort of then the ultimate question is facial recognition, overall speaking, is a more biased direction of AI innovation compared to, say, driverless cars or sort of medical AI. And if China is pushing so much of this AI development towards this direction, and would that crowd out researchers and resources poured into other AI development, and that would that show up in the global AI development and the global trade? This is the question we're actively looking into right now, and we don't have anything to say at the moment because we will need sort of a cross-sector variation, which is harder.
Let me follow up on this one. There are a few countries that are very intensively looking for ways to deal with terrorists.
Yeah.
So, and I can see the direct connection between the need for terrorists and the development of the product that you're talking about. So, is it possible to make some comparison across identical countries?
For the terrorists, so that's a good point.
You know, like in Singapore, we have to worry really about a lot of the terrorists. We had one terrorist attack.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, one thing that we can do, given that we just collected these trade data, is to see, are the countries who recently experienced public security shocks are disproportionately more likely to import things from China. Mm-hmm. And most of these importers at this point that we speak now are sort of essentially government entities, sort of airports getting the Chinese systems to put up, or cities importing the whole smart city system. So these are government buyers. And then the question is, holding everything as constant, is recent shocks in terrorist attacks or any public security sort of emergencies might have prompted them to go for the Chinese AI system. That's a question I think we have some leverage in answering, but I don't know the answer yet. I think we can look. Yeah.
So David, let me ask the final question. So I guess my question is broadly related to the point Matilde raised. So it's about local firms and the geography of those firms. So the big question is whether or not this booming AI, recent booming AI in China is related to economy of scale. The paper, I think the paper is more about the economy of scope. But I want to know more about the implications of the size of the economy. Say, suppose those firms are just located in big cities, in Beijing and Shanghai. They have access to data all over the places in China, and then they're growing very fast. So that means maybe this model cannot be replicated in other countries with smaller size. And also it's really striking to see the last two slides, from your recent work. I think these two things are really related. So have you have anything to say about, say, economy of scale of economy?
Great. Yeah, no, that's a great question. This also reminds me, I forgot to say one thing to respond to Matilda's. Like the other question you raised, I was going to turn around is you asked why the Chinese government are not sharing data to more firms. I think to put from economists of scale in the background, it will be why they're doing this to just 2 firms and then just push these 2 superstar firms to grow. And why you see such a decentralized market. I think that is very puzzling, but probably not surprising given how Chinese local government, local procurement has been done in all sectors and not unique to AI per se. Now, the one deep unsatisfaction that sort of my searching through the data science or the machine learning literature over the last year is that machine learning, from a theoretical perspective, you would have thought they have something to say about what's the scale of return for data, and actually don't have a good sort of answer to that. Like I don't think the literature is even converged on towards whether that return is convex or concave, which is hugely important to think about anything to do with IO in a sector. Now, the couple of things that we do know though is that you certainly don't need a country as the size of China to have some reasonable number of facial images that's useful to pass some threshold for AI. As you see, like country with a medium size of Turkey is way more enough. Now, what is particularly sort of again, all these are outside of the scope of the current paper, but the thing, just some things we learned from the machine learning literature is that what's particularly useful is that you observe 5 different faces of me in 5 different situations rather than 5 different people. That's more useful for the facial recognition AI firm. And what's even more useful is from an AI firm perspective is that not only do I see David's faces, but I also see sort of other behaviors of me in say online and offline. That would imply that sort of a lot of the return for these firms probably happens through vertical integration, right? A firm who control my online activity, observe my offline activity, also sort of have access to my facial data on the streets. It's going to have a disproportionately high value of generating AI algorithms than one firm that see everyone's faces, because again, it seems to be that's you don't need that for the whole country to have a reasonable accuracy, but sort of having multiple observation of the same individual across multiple domains, that's super high value. Which might imply that a lot of this firm might be vertically integrated within the local region, and then they get as much as they can on the same set of people, and then that's maybe have the highest return for data prediction algorithm. But these are speculative. I don't have anything explicit to say from our data, but just like some hints from the data science literature. It's a very unsatisfying literature to read from an economist perspective, because you don't have a theoretical answer even to what's the return of scale for data, which you think will be basic.
Okay, so I hope we will have more time to talk about this fantastic topic, but we have to stop here. Thank you, David and Matilde, again for this fascinating, stimulating presentation discussion. Bernie, do you have anything to say?
I just want to say thank you, David. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Matilde. This has been wonderful, and I want to thank the participants for joining us. I look forward to seeing you all again on December 1st. And Kouri Kawaguchi of HKUST will present a paper, Merger Analysis in the App Economy, an empirical model of ad-sponsored media. For those in North America, please watch out that you scale the clock back by 1 hour. So for you, we'll start 1 hour earlier. For us in Asia, same time, December 1st. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this and I learned a lot. Thank you to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.